Before moving further in our topic of motion in one dimension, we should understand the importance of following a standard process while studying any concept in physics or solving any problem. If we are pretty much thorough and clear of all the steps in our standard process, then solving any problem or understanding any concept in physics is a piece of cake. So, what are the steps involved in the standard process? First, we should be aware of the conditions and assumptions for any concept. All the concepts in physics are valid under certain conditions and assumptions. So if those conditions and assumptions are valid, then only that particular concept is applicable. So in our case of motion in one dimension, our condition and assumption is that the object which is under motion and under study, we consider it to be a point object. You might wonder that how this object which has definite size, shape, how can this object be considered as a point object? But I'll give you two criteria. If any of the among the two criteria are met, we can precisely assume any object to be a point object. First, suppose this is the same object which is there. We name it as M, which is definite size of, can say 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter. Now, if this same block is traveling for a distance of 1 kilometer or 100 kilometer or 1000 kilometer, then the size of the object with reference to the distance traveled is much smaller. So if the distances the first criteria is if the distances traveled by the object are much larger than the size of the object or the dimensions of the object, then we can precisely assume that this object is, or we can treat this object like a point object. The second criteria is all the parts of the object have the same physical quantities. Physical quantities in our case is distance, displacement, velocity, acceleration, and time. So if I'll just magnify this object, and if we divide this object into various parts, then there can be n number of parts. As you decrease the size of the part and the number of parts increases or tends towards infinity, then if all these infinite parts has the same physical quantity, that is, have the same displacement, have the same velocity, have the same acceleration, then we can precisely assume that this object, or we can treat this object as a point object. Here, if you have, this is part 1, part 2, part 3, 4, 5. So, if we say distance traveled by part 1 is equal to distance traveled by part 2 d3 so forth, so on. So if all these parts, part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if all these parts has the same displacement and the same velocity, we can precisely say that this object, or we can precisely treat this object as a point object.